Paris has been burned, occupied, starved, bombed, terrorized, and nearly erased more times than most nations have existed, and yet it refuses to die. Not because it is beautiful, not because it is romantic, but because it has mastered something far more dangerous: survival through reinvention. For more than 2,000 years, this city has stood at the epicenter of empire, revolution, faith, art, and bloodshed. It has executed its own king in public. It has watched half its population vanish in plague. It has flown the Nazi flag above the Eiffel Tower. It has heard the crack of gunfire in cafes and the roar of flames consuming Notre-Dame. And every time the world assumes this is the end, Paris rebuilds. But survival alone does not explain Paris. Other cities survived. Other capitals endured war. What makes Paris different is that it doesn't just recover, it reshapes history. It exports ideas that destabilize monarchies. It inspires revolutions across oceans. It turns suffering into philosophy defeat, into architecture trauma, into identity. So the real question is not how Paris became the city of light. The real question is why this city again and again stands at the fault line of history, and what its story reveals about power, resilience, and the cost of freedom. Long before Paris became a symbol of elegance, revolution, or intellectual firepower, it was nothing more than a fragile settlement, clinging to survival on a small island in the middle of the Seine River. Around 259 BC, the Parisi tribe chose Ile de la Cité not for glory, but for advantage. The river was protection. The crossing point was power. Control the water, and you controlled trade. There were no cathedrals, no stone boulevards, no grand ambitions, only wooden huts, boats, and a community shaped by instinct rather than ideology. Then, in 52 BC, the machinery of Rome arrived. Julius Caesar's legions swept through Gaul with calculated force. The settlement resisted and was burned. What stood there was erased. But Rome did what Rome always did. It rebuilt. Lutetia rose from ash on the left bank, engineered with straight roads, public baths, and an amphitheater seating roughly 15,000 people. Civilization replaced improvisation. Order replaced tribal rhythm. For a time, life was stable, structured under imperial law and military discipline. Yet even Rome was mortal. By the 3rd century AD, as Germanic tribes pressed southward and imperial authority weakened, the people retreated once more to the island. Walls went up. Defenses tightened. The lesson was brutal, but clear permanence is an illusion. Empires promise eternity, but survival belongs to those who adapt. In its earliest centuries, before it even bore the name Paris, this city learned the truth that would define its future. Strength is not in never falling, but in rebuilding before the ashes cool. By the 5th century, the world that had built Lutetia was collapsing. The Roman Empire, once the unshakable spine of Western civilization, was fracturing under invasion and decay. In 451 AD, fear swept through the city as Attila the Hun advanced across Europe, leaving burned settlements and shattered armies behind him. The residents of the island prepared to abandon everything. Survival meant flight. But in that moment of collective panic, a young woman named Genevieve stood against the tide of terror. She urged the people not to flee, but to remain, to pray, to hold their ground. Whether driven by faith, strategy, or coincidence, Attila's forces bypassed the city. The immediate threat vanished, but something far more powerful remained: belief. Genevieve became more than a figure of legend. She became a symbol that Paris could endure forces greater than itself. That psychological transformation mattered. When structures collapse, cities survive on conviction. In 508 AD, Clovis, the first king of the Franks, chose Paris as the capital of his kingdom and converted to Christianity, permanently binding political authority to spiritual identity. The city was no longer a fading Roman outpost. It was the heart of a rising power. Churches began to rise where fortifications once defined the skyline. The name Paris, echoing the ancient Parisi tribe, returned not as nostalgia, but as declaration. The city had reclaimed itself. This was the moment Paris shifted from defensive survival to deliberate destiny. Faith and monarchy fused together, giving the city coherence in an age of chaos. In a continent being carved apart by tribal conquest, Paris anchored itself in belief, and in doing so, it laid the foundation for something larger than territory, a capital defined by conviction rather than fear. By the 12th century, Paris was no longer merely surviving history, it was beginning to shape it. In 1163, construction began on what would become Notre-Dame Cathedral, an undertaking so ambitious it seemed to challenge gravity itself. Stone by stone over nearly 2 centuries, craftsmen, masons, and visionaries transformed faith into architecture. Flying buttresses arched outward like skeletal wings, rose windows filtered light into color and fire, and vaulted ceilings soared toward heaven, as if daring humanity to reach beyond its limits. Notre Dame was not simply a religious structure. It was a statement of permanence in a world still haunted by instability. At the same time, on the left bank, another force was rising, one built not of limestone, but of language and thought. The University of Paris emerged as one of Europe's earliest intellectual centers, drawing scholars from across the continent. In the Latin Quarter, students debated theology, philosophy, and law in a shared scholarly tongue, constructing arguments that would influence medieval Europe's moral and legal foundations. Ideas traveled from these streets into courts, kingdoms, and cathedrals. Under King Philip II, who ruled from 1180 to 1223, the city physically transformed as well. Streets were paved, markets expanded, and the original Louvre fortress rose as a defensive symbol of royal authority. By 1300, the population approached 200,000, placing Paris among the largest cities in Europe. Commerce thrived, guilds organized, trade bridges multiplied across the Seine. The city had crossed a threshold. It was no longer a fortified refuge or a fragile capital. It was a center of gravity. Yet with prominence came vulnerability. The higher Paris rose spiritually, intellectually, politically, the more visible it became to the forces that would soon test its strength in ways no cathedral wall could withstand. The 14th century did not test Paris, it nearly erased it. The prosperity of the previous era dissolved into hunger when harvests failed across Europe in the 1310s and famine hollowed out entire neighborhoods. But scarcity was only the beginning. In 1337, the Hundred Years' War ignited a brutal struggle between England and France, placing Paris at the political center of a generational conflict. Then in 1348, the Black Death arrived without warning or mercy. Within months, death moved faster than prayer. Historians estimate that between 1/3 and 1/2 of the city's population perished. Streets that once carried merchants and scholars carried carts of bodies instead. The air itself seemed infected with despair. Trade collapsed, families vanished, and entire districts fell silent. Just as the city began to recover, foreign banners appeared over its skyline. In 1420, Paris fell to English forces and their Burgundian allies, and for 16 years, its people lived under occupation. Authority spoke with an unfamiliar accent. Loyalty became dangerous. Out of this darkness emerged a 17-year-old peasant named Joan of Arc, claiming divine guidance. Though she did not directly free Paris, her victories shifted the war's momentum and restored belief to a fractured nation. Captured and executed in 1431 at just 19 years old, she became a martyr whose impact outlived her body. Paris was liberated in 1436, but liberation did not erase trauma. The city had endured plague war and foreign rule in less than a century. Survival now carried scars. Yet even in exhaustion, Paris refused disappearance. The 16th century opened with elegance and ambition, as if Paris were determined to outshine the traumas of the past. Under King Francis I, who ruled from 1515 to 1547, the city embraced the Renaissance with deliberate intensity. Italian art and humanist thought flowed northward, reshaping French culture. The Louvre began its transformation from a medieval fortress into a refined royal palace, signaling that Paris no longer saw itself merely as defensible territory, but as a stage for sophistication and power. Francis invited Leonardo da Vinci to France, and though the master spent his final years far from Paris itself, his presence symbolized a nation aligning itself with genius, creativity, and intellectual renewal. For a moment it seemed as though Paris had stepped into a golden dawn where architecture, scholarship, and courtly refinement defined its future. But beneath that surface of refinement, fault lines were widening. By the 1560s, France was violently divided between Catholics and Protestant Huguenots, and Paris stood fiercely on the Catholic side. Suspicion hardened into hatred, political tension fused with religious fury. On August 24, 1572, the St. Bartholomew's Day massacre erupted after an attempted assassination of Protestant leaders. What followed was not a controlled purge, but a frenzy. Catholic mobs hunted Protestants through the streets, breaking into homes, dragging victims into public squares, and casting bodies into the Seine. The killings continued for days. Thousands died in Paris alone, and the violence spread throughout France, claiming tens of thousands more nationwide. The city that had celebrated art and intellect became a theater of terror. Civilization did not collapse. It revealed its darker twin. Paris learned again that beauty and brutality are not opposites, they are neighbors. The Renaissance had promised enlightenment, but the streets ran red. And yet even from that blood-soaked chapter, Paris did not retreat from history. It absorbed the trauma, reshaped its identity once more, and prepared for a transformation that would shake the foundations of monarchy itself. The 17th century marked a calculated transformation of Paris into a symbol of centralized authority and cultural dominance. Under Louis XIII and his chief minister, Cardinal Richelieu, power was no longer fragmented among feuding nobles. It was consolidated, disciplined, and orchestrated from the capital. In 1635, Richelieu founded the Académie Française, an institution designed not merely to celebrate language, but to regulate it, to define what French was and what it was not. Control of words meant control of identity. Paris was becoming the stage upon which national power performed itself. Then came Louis XIV, the Sun King, ascending the throne in 1643. He understood that spectacle could reinforce supremacy. The Louvre expanded, grand boulevards were commissioned, and monuments such as Les Invalides rose as architectural declarations of royal strength. Paris projected magnificent symmetry and confidence. Yet beneath the gilded image lingered unease. In 1682, Louis XIV made a decisive move. He relocated the royal court to Versailles, nearly 12 miles outside the city. It was not distance for comfort. It was distance for control. Paris had a history of unrest, of challenging authority, and the king chose to govern from a palace insulated from the volatility of the capital. Even without the monarch physically present, Paris thrived culturally. Salons flourished where intellectuals debated philosophy and art. Cuisine and fashion refined themselves into exportable symbols of sophistication. Europe began to mirror Parisian taste. The city had become both the cultural heartbeat of the continent and a reminder that grandeur and distrust could coexist. Power radiated outward from Paris, even as it kept one cautious eye on the people within it. The 18th century began in refinement and ended in rupture. Paris stood at the epicenter of the Enlightenment, where cafes and salons became laboratories of radical thought. Philosophers like Voltaire and Rousseau challenged monarchy, church authority, and inherited privilege, arguing that reason, not birthright, should define power. The Encyclopédie sought to gather all human knowledge into print, quietly undermining centuries of unquestioned doctrine. Ideas circulated through the city like sparks in dry air. But beneath the intellectual brilliance, reality was decaying. By the 1780s, Paris held more than 600,000 people, many crammed into unsanitary, overcrowded neighborhoods. Bread prices soared. The poor starved while aristocrats remained insulated in luxury. Even death overwhelmed the city. Cemeteries overflowed and millions of skeletal remains were transferred into underground limestone tunnels that became the catacombs, a silent architecture of mortality beneath the streets. Bankruptcy from war and royal excess pushed France to the brink. On July 14, 1789, Parisians stormed the Bastille not for its 7 prisoners, but for what it represented: absolute power without accountability. The French Revolution ignited, and Paris became its volatile stage. In January 1793, King Louis XVI was executed by guillotine before a massive crowd. Months later, Marie Antoinette followed. The reign of terror consumed nobles, priests, and revolutionaries alike as thousands met the blade. Blood flowed where philosophy once flourished. Paris had transformed from debating freedom to enforcing it with steel. In overthrowing a monarchy, the city did more than change France. It reshaped the global understanding of liberty, proving that ideas once unleashed can dismantle empires. Out of revolution's exhaustion emerged ambition once more. In 1799, Napoleon Bonaparte seized power, and Paris became the capital of an empire determined to leave its mark on history. Napoleon understood symbolism as well as strategy. In 1806, he commissioned the Arc de Triomphe to honor his armies, a monument meant to immortalize victory in stone. He reformed France's legal system through the Napoleonic Code, reshaping civil law in ways that would influence much of Europe. The Louvre expanded as a public museum filled with treasures carried back from conquered territories, transforming Paris into a cultural vault of empire. Yet, glory built on conquest is fragile. After the disastrous invasion of Russia in 1812 and crushing defeats that followed, foreign armies marched into Paris in 1814. The emperor abdicated, returned briefly during the 100 Days, then fell finally at Waterloo in 1815. The dream collapsed as quickly as it had risen. Decades later, under Napoleon III, Paris would again be transformed, this time by design rather than war. Baron Haussmann carved wide boulevards through medieval streets, installing modern sewers and uniform facades. The city became grand, luminous, and orderly. But beneath the elegance was calculation. Wide avenues were harder to barricade. Even beauty carried the imprint of control. Paris has never been a flawless city, and perhaps that is precisely why it endures. Across 2,000 years, it has been conquered, starved, occupied, divided, and shaken by forces both foreign and internal. It has witnessed plague carts in its streets, guillotines in its squares, enemy flags over its skyline, and flames consuming its most sacred landmarks. Yet each time history seemed ready to close its chapter, Paris refused the ending. It rebuilt from ash, redefined itself after humiliation, and transformed trauma into identity. The city's power does not lie only in its monuments or museums, but in its relentless willingness to confront collapse and begin again. Paris teaches a difficult truth. Survival is not passive endurance, it is deliberate reinvention. Its scars are visible, its contradictions undeniable, but within them lives a stubborn conviction that people have the right to shape their destiny. And as long as that belief remains, Paris will continue to rise. Paris reminds us that history is not a straight line toward progress. It is a cycle of ambition, collapse, and rebuilding. For American audiences, its story feels familiar. A nation founded on revolution understands that liberty is never permanently secured. It must be defended, questioned, and sometimes reimagined. Paris shows what happens when inequality is ignored, when power grows distant from the people, when fear is allowed to divide a society. But it also proves something equally important: ideas are stronger than empires, and communities that adapt can outlast crisis. The warning is clear: stability is fragile. The lesson is, stronger resilience is learned. If this deep dive into the rise and reinvention of Paris gave you a new perspective, share it with someone who loves history, and subscribe for more investigative journeys into the cities and events that shaped our world.